Good morning. Welcome to the Morning Momentum this beautiful Thursday. As usual, this is a daily compendium of local and international news, human interest stories, current affairs, and expert opinion. My name is Alfonsoh Ouma. Remember, you can be part of the conversation via our SMS line 0719144144. Let's take a look at the top stories making the headlines on the papers this morning. We start with the Standard newspaper. The puzzle of Elnino billions. Now, government set aside 10 billion shillings to mitigate the effects of heavy rains. However, the county governments have been told to adjust their allocations to help victims. Governors are up in arms, but Deputy President is adamant as the big boys trade blame wananchi are suffering. So where is the money? That is the big question this morning, and more of that story is beefed up for you on page 2 of the Standard newspaper. In other news, why candidates are shunning UDA elections, that story is beefed up for you on page 6. On page 4, report exposes shock losses in Uganda botched oil deal. Now, analysis shows Kenya will lose billions if they do not offer neighbor incentives to return. The report by Kenya Pipeline Corporation further shows how the deal was skewed in favor of Kenya. We'll take a look at that story on page 4. On page 3, police ran into headwinds in Mainanjenga case. Officers have failed to link Mainanjenga to any crimes, while weapons picked from his home were not linked to the people arrested. About 35 witnesses will testify. In world news, Israel-Hamas agree on ceasefire. That story is beefed up for you on page 29. Business news, KCB assets cross 2 trillion mark. And lastly, on sports news, Giants fall to Minos in qualifiers. That story on page 40. Let's take a look at page 2 of the Standard this morning. Governors refute Gachagua claim that 10 billion shillings given to fight El Nino. Council says no funds were deployed to counties where floods have killed 52 and displaced over 80,000 families. Waiguru says 13 counties are owed 10.17 billion for September, and 27 counties are owed 19.64 billion for October. You want to catch up with more of that story on page 2. On page 3 of the Standard this morning, there was no Mungiki meeting at Njenga's home, says state witness. Now, police inspector who raided Mainanjenga's home says he was not at home. Njenga and 11 others are accused of belonging to the outlawed gang. You want to catch up with more of that story on page 3 of the Standard this morning. Let's take a look at page 4. Kenya to lose billions in Uganda oil import. Now, Kenya Pipeline Company cautions that Tanzania is becoming a cheaper route for transit fuel in the region. Kenyans to pay more if the firm loses 51% revenue from the neighboring countries, and more of that story is beefed up for you on page 4. Let's take a look at page 6. Apathy. Contentious leaders forced UDA to postpone elections. Officials attributed the lack of member interest to serve the ruling party to the high cost of living and failure by the government to honor its promises. Elected leaders say they feared going to the grassroots because supporters remind them they have not fulfilled their promises. Now, we have Mutahi Kahiga, and I'll quote what he said. We will not stand for efforts to water down the position of the deputy party leader. We maintain that the party constitution must conform to the constitution of Kenya. More of that story on page 6. On page 7, CS says plans on to clear 133 billion bills and modernize JKIA. Murkomen says the 150 billion owed to road contractors, government has paid 17 billion. Plans underway for President Ruto's legacy project for a modern terminal in 3 years. That story is beefed up for you on page 7. Also, integrity test, woman in 17 billion oil dispute fails to appear before MPs. The woman at the center of controversial 17 billion diesel import yesterday failed to appear before National Assembly Departmental Committee on Energy. Anjeri was expected to shed light on the ownership, source, and the destination of the cargo that the government says is not hers. You want to catch up with more of that story on page 7. Let's move on to page 10. Smooth States Digital Services fast to generate more revenue. Kenya Kwanza administration doing commendable job by bringing more services on e-citizen. Instead of obsessing with digitalization as a revenue stream, government should first ensure the platforms are seamless. And more of that story is beefed up for you on page 10. On page 11, journalists should embrace novel technology shaping media future. Participants at the second Global Media Congress discussed the way forward in a fast-evolving world. News consumers' changing habits and emerging new technologies take center stage at annual event. More of that story on page 11. Let's take a look at page 14, and that is now the expert opinion. SAPs failed Africa in the 90s. Why go back to them today? Is Kenya undergoing a contemporary internation of the structural adjustment programs that were implemented across Africa in the 1980s and the 1990s? You can catch up with more of those sentiments on page 14. Now, let's move on to other news inside the Standard this morning. Shipping and logistics. The big divide. Why Africa's shipping lags behind. Shipping experts recommend incentives to support local vessel ownership and shipbuilding. Now, lack of strong policies as well as poor investment from governments is grounding the shipping industry in Africa. Analysis reports now say, and you want to catch up with more of that story on page 20 of the Standard this morning. Let's now shift gears and take a look at business news. KCB assets across 2 trillion shillings as third quarter profit hits 30.7 billion shillings. Regional subsidiaries continue to increase their contribution to the group's revenue. CEO Paul Russo says performance shows lender on track to meet its full year ambitions. More of that story on page 22. For the real estate enthusiast, you have the real estate article beefed up for you inside the Standard this morning as well. And it's a report this morning, how low-income families can afford homes. That story is beefed up for you on 27. You have amazing insights on that article on how low and middle income families can afford housing. More of it inside the real estate article. Let us now shift gears and take a look at the international news inside the Standard this morning. Cheats and parasites inside oil row causing jitters in East Africa. Museveni accuses Kenyan middlemen of inflating oil prices by up to 58%. Uganda has for years imported 90% of its fuel from Kenyan oil marketing companies. A bitter row over fuel supplies has erupted between Kenya and its landlocked neighbor, Uganda. You want to catch up with that story on page 29. In the Middle East, Israel-Hamas agree to pause Gaza fighting. A deal has been struck between Israel and Hamas to release 50 hostages and hold a pause in fighting to allow humanitarian supplies into the Gaza Strip. In Hamas' statement, more details have been given as to how that pause might look on the ground in Gaza. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 29. Let's take a look at page 30. Ellen Silef, Kenyan Bag Time 100 Impact Award. A Kenyan community change mobilizer has received the Times Time 100 Impact Award alongside other eminent African personalities, among them former Liberia President Ellen Johnson. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 30. Let's move on to other stories, and that is now the sports news inside the Standard this morning. Why many have faith in Kipyegon to win top WA award. The double world champion is among the finalists for Athlete of the Year. She broke 3 world records this season, apart from the 2 global titles. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 37. Let us now take a look at page 38. Kenya's Western Jaguars claw parachute battalion. Jaguars saw off Malawi's battalion 13 goals to nil to move second in the standings. Blazers unbeaten run halted after 4 goals to 1 defeat to champions Ghana Revenue Authority. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 38. On page 39, wheat separated from the chaff in Euro 2024 qualifiers. Hosts Germany, England, and 19 other teams have already qualified for the tournament. The other 3 places will be decided through the playoffs. More of that story again is beefed up for you on page 39. On the World Cup qualifiers, joy for Morocco, pain for Ghana and South Africa. Morocco made a winning start to their 2026 World Cup qualifying, but several African heavyweights endured humbling results on Tuesday. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 29. Still under World Cup qualifiers, Messi feels there could have been a tragedy in victory over Brazil. Lionel Messi believes there could have been a tragedy during the crowd trouble that delayed Argentina's World Cup qualifier against Brazil. Now, lastly, let's take a look at the cover page of the Standard this morning. Comoros shock Ghana as Senegal and Cameroon held. Top nations find it tough in 2026 World Cup qualifiers as Rwanda beat South Africa. Are you back as Black Stars captain? But they were beaten once again by Comoros. More of that story is beefed up for you on the cover page of the Standard this morning. With that story of Comoros, we take a quick break and then we are coming back with the top stories making the headlines on the Daily Nation. See you on the other side of this broadcast.
Imagine waking up to a show every morning that entertains, educates,
that keeps you glued to the screen with interesting topics. Talk about health, fashion, business, fitness, and spiritual nourishment. Whether you're enjoying your cup of coffee, tea, milk, or uji, Younib Breakfast Show is the place to be. Every Tuesday and Wednesday at 8:30 a.m. with me, Penina Washara, here on Younib TV.
Welcome back to the Morning Momentum. If you are just joining us, my name is Alfonsoh Ouma. Now, let's take a look at the top stories making the headlines on the Daily Nation this morning. How Treasury gifted farm 5 billion shillings for air. Project is still pending, but contractor moved to court and won hefty award. A 2009 tender to build an alternative data recovery center in Naivasha which little-known Miss South Africa won and which was initially estimated to cost around 800 million, has now ballooned to 5 billion shillings in a botched deal that brings into focus the frivolous manner in which public projects are implemented. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 4 and page 5. On page 6, Azimio tax cuts to wait, Ndungu tells talks team. The talks team formed by President William Ruto and opposition leader Raila Odinga will make public report on Saturday, even as National Treasury Cabinet Secretary Njuguna Ndung'u said the proposed tax cuts cannot be implemented immediately. On page 3, my escape from Shakahola's grip of death. Unlike 429 dead men, women and children who will tell no tales about what it was like to live in Shakahola, Salama Masha, whose name in Kiswahili means safe, is able to narrate the horrors she lived through as other cult members succumbed to starvation and butchery of the worst kind. On page 2, governors clash with Gachagua over Elnino cash. In matters education, move junior school to secondary to save funds, Ruto urged, and more of that story is beefed up for you on the cover page. Let's take a look at page 2. Governors clash with Deputy President over El Nino response funds. County bosses accuse National Treasury of delaying disbursements. Gachagua says counties need to relocate funds in their budgets. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 2. Of course, yesterday, the Council of Governors issued a joint statement saying that the counties have not yet received any amount from the national government to mitigate the El Nino rains damages. Let's take a look at page 3, how I escaped death in Shakahola jungle. Unlike 429 dead men, women and children, Salama, whose name in Swahili means safe, is today able to narrate the horrors she lived through. She remembers the preacher talking of the end of the world, interweaving biblical verses with contemporary events. Salama Masha stares into the twilight as if scoring its dusky humidity for answers, perhaps its words to describe her ordeal that failed her. Pearls of raindrops hang on to bending leaves in waterlogged bushes as the darkness speedily gathers. You want to catch up with more of that story on page 3. Go back to God. Preachers claimed Huduma number COVID-19 vaccines were unchristian. If you want to catch up with that story of Salama, it's beefed up for you on page 3 of the Daily Nation this morning. Let's take a look at page 4. How Treasury blunders gifted little-known firm 5 billion Kenya shillings. Now, a tender which Miss South Africa won and which was initially estimated to cost 800 million shillings has now ballooned to 5 billion. Miss South Africa Limited got more than it had bargained for in a botched deal that brings into sharp focus the frivolous manner in which public projects are being implemented in the country. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 4 and page 5. Let's take a look at page 6. No tax cuts as talks team release report on Saturday. A tax policy review to be implemented in February could make some of the changes. Azimio la Umoja One Kenya Coalition Party has been pushing for a review of the Finance Act 2023. You want to catch up with more of that story on NADCO on page 6. Let's take a look at page 9. MPs to visit Saudi Arabia, Russia in 17 billion fuel shillings probe. Njeri yesterday failed to appear before MPs, saying she is unwell. A National Assembly committee now plans to visit Russia and Saudi Arabia as part of efforts to get to the bottom of the 17 billion shillings fuel saga. The lawmakers also want to get Ms. Njeri's bank details to establish her creditworthiness as well as summon key government officials. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 9. Let's take a look at page 10. Doubts over readiness for the next pandemic. COVID-19 exposed the first frailties in East Africa's healthcare systems. Experts question whether leadership and financial structures are effective. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 10. Also, Ruto roots for more investment in local production of drugs. President William Ruto has called for massive investment in local production of pharmaceuticals and consumable medical supplies, saying these items account for roughly 20% of total medical expenditures in the country. Let's move on to some other stories, and that lands us to page 14 of the Daily Nation. Subsidiaries hold KCB Group's 9-month net profit at 30 billion shillings. Lenders CEO projects that the group will meet its full-year targets. KCB Bank Kenya posted an 8.8% drop in earnings, while Kenyan subsidiary Nash NBK had a 3 billion shillings loss. That story is beefed up for you on page 14. Let's now shift gears and take a look at the expert opinion. Control antimicrobial use to address drug resistance. The World Health Organization ranks AMR among the top 10 public health threats. Those are sentiments by Winnie Accorth. Also, no one-term presidents here. These are sentiments by Charles Onyango Obo, who says, and I quote, "Looking ahead, it will be many years before free and fair elections deliver one-term presidents in East Africa." You want to catch up with those sentiments on page 19. Let's move on to county news on the Daily Nation this morning. We start with Murang'a County. State of County, Kangata addresses rains and revenue. Administration will use emergency fund to mend infrastructure damage, governor says. The target is 1 billion shillings that the county government is hoping to raise in on-source revenue this year. In Nairobi County, concern as gang terrorizes Mukuru residents. Frightened residents of the Mukuru Kayaba informal settlement spent the wee hours of Tuesday morning in terror as gang of marauding robbers attacked them in their homes as the heavy rains pounded away, making any efforts to respond to distress calls an uphill task. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 24. Briefly, in Nyamira County to create on water farm. In Kirinyaga, state starts to buy rice from farmers. In Kilifi County, Mungaro takes services to locals. Governor Gideon Mungaro has launched the second phase of his community outreach initiative, dispatching all his executives to the wards to enhance service delivery. Let's move on to Bomet County. Barchok fails to explain 204 million shillings pending bills. Governor and his finance officials give differing explanations for variance. County officials accused of presenting shoddy documents. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 26. Now let's move on to international news. Gaza bloodletting shocks a Palestinian war veterans. The Oslo Accords were signed by Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin. Authorities in Gaza say 14,100 people have been killed by Israeli forces. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 28. Rwanda marks key day with launch of parenting guidelines. Rwanda and UNICEF urge parents and child caregivers to recommit to playing their roles in ensuring children enjoy their rights during celebrations to mark World Children's Day on Monday. Briefly, in Addis Ababa, peace talks between the Ethiopian government and the Oromo Liberation Army rebel group have ended without an agreement, a government official said on Tuesday. Also in Juba, South Sudan, government officials met members of Sudan's civilian coalition, the Forces of Freedom and Change, on Tuesday in an effort to push for a cessation of hostilities before the start of political negotiations aimed at ending the war that erupted on April 15th. More of that story on page 28. Let's now shift gears to business news. Standard Chartered Q3 profit at 9.7 billion declares dividend. Also in agriculture, tea overflows in depots on auction price standoff. Groups want government order set aside to sort out mess. KTGSA's fixed list prices on produce, hurting those it wasn't meant to protect. Briefly, in real estate, vacancy delays Muranga building plans approval. In aviation, KQ now returns to Bangkok after a 3-year break. Also in finance, fintech company FFHL now joins CMS Sandbox. Now let's shift gears to the DN2 property beyond real estate. Where else you can put money as an investor? That is an article that has more amazing insights on where investors can put their money, and it is beefed up for you inside the Daily Nation this morning. I think it is now time that we look at the sports news. We start with athletics. Elites for Chepsaita as Farouk talks of dream to get youth out of drugs. Now, World Cross-Country Championships medalists are among elite athletes expected at the inaugural Chepsaita Cross-Country Championships scheduled for December 2nd at the Chepsaita Secondary School in Uasin Gishu. Let's take a look at cricket. Kenya out to keep winning run in African qualifier. Kenya will today be seeking to maintain their perfect start of the 2023 International Cricket Council Men's T20 World Cup's Africa Regional Qualifier when they face Nigeria at the United Cricket Club ground in Windhoek, Namibia. Also, why Kenya should bid for FIVB Under-17 World Championships. These are sentiments by Samuel Gacharira. The Kenya Kwanza government has backed sports in a way that has not been seen before. In Senate, Namwamba Ministry, AK to register athletes, set up database. The government, in conjunction with Athletics Kenya, has developed a database for the registration of athletes to enhance talent management, avert doping issues, and improve accountability across the country. More of that story is beefed up for you on page 45. On page 46, Sharma, Indian-born player on the verge of achieving key milestone with Kenya. 23-year-old marketing manager out to shine with the Bat for Waraka club and national team. Let's take a look at page 47. Namwamba, state seeking to push Safari deal beyond 2026. Now, Sports CS tells Senate committee that government is working on 3-year extension. Let's take a look at the cover page. Union asks Ruto to move junior secondary schools to secondary schools. Milemba says state will save 100 billion by revising decision. Decision to have junior high in primary schools was proposed by Education Reforms team. More of that story on the cover page. Also, exam season ends with KCP results expected today. The examination season will come to a close tomorrow after almost 1 month of activities in which over 3.6 million candidates sat tests ahead of transition to various levels of education next year. Also, we plan to have new JKIA terminal in 3 years, says CS. Road Transport Cabinet Secretary Kipchumba Murkomen has announced the government intends to construct a modern terminal at the JKIA in 3 years. The CS said the government is working on a public-private partnership model for the new terminal with an advertisement for the contract to be done in January next year. 20 billion shillings is the amount claimed for breach of contract by 2 firms that had been contracted to build the Greenfield terminal. Now, with that story of a new terminal in JKIA, we come to the end of today's session of the Morning Momentum. Thank you so much for choosing to stay with Younib TV. And by extension, many thanks to all those who made this broadcast a success. The Chief Controller, Anifa, Kavira. See you tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, do have a beautiful Thursday. My name is Alfonsoh Ouma.
Audio Jungle.